Morning. So today I wanted to delve a little bit more into the metaphysical. I know I've talked a little bit previously about, whether or not we're living in a simulation and, the kind of theories about there being, multiple dimensions or, infinite realities. And I think there's, no real way to know whether that's true or not, but it's fun to think about. And I guess when you consider, infinite space and time, and maybe, infinite parallel dimensions. I mean, when you talk about infinity is a hard concept to wrap your head around. But if you call infinity, the set of all possible realities, it's a pretty wide net you're casting. And so anything that conceivably could exist would exist if we're saying that, there's literally no end to space and time and parallel dimensions or whatever, alternate realities. And I don't think that's a new idea. And what got me thinking about it again was actually C.S. Lewis. And people talk about the Chronicles of Narnia as a Christian allegory. And if you read it that way, it certainly is heavy-handed allegory. But I don't think it's actually allegory. I mean, if you really read the whole set of books, and I read them over and over and over as a kid, and that was really my introduction to kind of, fantasy literature. But, I mean, first of all, most people are, I would say, most familiar with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? And it's set at, during the London Blitz, right? So, I mean, it's set in the real world, or at least in a recognizable world. And when I say that, I guess I'll expand on that in a minute, but, I mean, potentially it is our world or another world very similar to ours. And again, there's no way to know just reading the books. Lucy, the youngest girl, finds her way through the wardrobe and into Narnia, and, a different world with different set of rules. But like, there's still some overlap, right? And what people kind of hang their hat on as far as Christian allegory is, and I mean, C.S. Lewis was a Christian. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there was certainly, metaphor that he was trying to, make about, his Christian beliefs about the world. But again, I don't think it's actually allegory. Again, if you're reading the world, or the story, they talk about Aslan and the Emperor over the sea, and how, they exist in our world by another name, right? So it's not like this is, divorced from at least our concept of reality. It's just they're literally in another place with similar rules, and there's some overlap, right? And what really drives this home, and maybe fewer people, if you haven't read the whole book series, and most people are kind of just passingly familiar with, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but The Magician's Nephew, which is kind of the prequel book in the series, even though it didn't come first, but chronologically in the narrative, it comes first. And the main two children find their way via some magic rings into a place they called the Wood Between Worlds. And I think that's a fascinating way to describe kind of the metaverse or multi-dimensional parallel realms of existence, right? And I mean, they're in this wood, this forest, and there's just a series of pools kind of stretching into infinity, and they step into a different pool and they find themselves in a completely different world, a different reality. And I think that's fascinating, right? And that's not really biblical. again, if C.S. Lewis is trying to beat us over the head with Christian allegory, I don't think there's really any textual basis in the Bible for multiverse theory, right? But clearly, I mean, C.S. Lewis was looking for a way to explain the existence of Narnia. And actually, in The Magician's Nephew, you see yet another world, or the world of Sharn, which is where the White Witch in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe came from, right? And she was actually the last queen of a dying society on a world that was, on its last legs. And she found her way, hitching a ride with the children along with these magic rings, into our world briefly, and then into Narnia. And that's how the White Witch got there in the first place. Which, again, fascinating. How, if you look at the origin story, right, in The Magician's Nephew, and the way Narnia comes into being, it's through song, right? And contemporary to C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, again, if you get into just past The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and into the larger, lore of the universe, and read the Silmarillion, the first chapter of the Silmarillion is called the Music of the Ainur. And the Ainur are basically the angels, and there's Eru Iluvatar, who is analogous to Jehovah, analogous to C.S. Lewis's Emperor Beyond the Sea, right? It's the first mover, the creator being, right? I did a video previously, is there a God? And again, I think both of them were kind of wrestling with how to classify that idea, that concept, right? And I talked a little bit about, how specific or how generalized you want to be in that definition. And everybody falls somewhere on that spectrum when they're talking about a definition for that idea of a god. But again, the Silmarillion and the world of the Lord of the Rings, the lore, it's not Christian allegory. And I'm fairly certain Tolkien specifically said he despised allegory. And what he was writing was a mythology, for, the British Isles, or Western Europe generally, right? And again, if you read the full story, it is almost like he was theorizing about maybe some kind of antediluvian society, right? Amazon's coming out with a new Tolkien world sort of based story from the Lord of the Rings lore, and there's an island called Numenor, which is totally Atlantis, right? And Atlantis, maybe it may or may not have existed in some respect in our world, and what the ancient Greeks were talking about when they referred to as Atlantis. And there's all sorts of speculation about whether it had some kind of basis in reality, or if it was even myth to them. And people point to certain things, like the Minoan civilization maybe being what they were referring to, or ideas about the Sahara, before it had dried out and gone through desertification, and in I forget which country it is, but there's something called the Eye of the Sahara, which if the Sahara had been green, right, it might have actually been kind of this place vaguely fitting the description of Atlantis, and maybe it was actually, it did get submerged briefly through some kind of cataclysm, but now it's actually out in the middle of the Sahara Desert. I don't know. There's ideas about it, and I mean, you can go down the rabbit hole there. That's not really kind of what I'm talking about here so much as, again, Tolkien and Numenor and, the Lord of the Rings world generally is, kind of a mythological, just play in the idea of an antediluvian society. and that kind of explains maybe what was going on in the world before recorded history, which in itself is fascinating because we continue to find structures and artifacts from well before kind of acknowledged recorded history that continue to push the date of the birth of civilization back farther and farther, which is it's just interesting. The fascinating thing about that to me, and again, if we're talking about multi-dimensional, infinite realities, and that using maybe the wood between worlds is kind of a metaphor for that, right? And there being some maybe connection or crossover or base code, maybe you could say, to the simulation. And if in the set of all possible worlds, it includes anything conceivable, right? Then potentially you could have, if we're really talking about infinite space and time, a situation where there was any of your favorite fantasy, mythology, right? Be it, Chronicles of Narnia, Lord of the Rings, Warhammer 40K, Harry Potter, in the set of all possible things existing, there is a possible reality where that exists, right? And where there is a real Harry Potter out there somewhere, God help us. I think it's fascinating too that, again, both Lewis and Tolkien were Christians, but they chose song as the form of, or the manner, the mechanism of creation in the origin stories for their worlds, right? And in the Bible, in Genesis, God spoke the world into existence, but they chose song for some reason, which is interesting. And you can get real woo-woo into, like healing crystals and, harmonic resonance and all that stuff. And, but there is something that does literally resonate inside of human beings with song. And so I think it's fascinating that they picked that out. And again, if, there's a, infinite universe, or we're living in a simulation among infinite simulations, and we don't really have a firm understanding of where ideas even come from, it makes one wonder, like, if all this were true. And again, we're suspending disbelief here heavily for a moment, but we just say, for the sake of argument, all that is true, right? And consciousness is some kind of, emergent property of the world we live in, and we don't have a firm understanding of where thoughts and ideas truly emerge from. It kind of makes you wonder if there isn't some bleed over between a very near, very similar reality to us, where we are, resonating or vibrating at a similar frequency to other us's in other realities, and that there's this kind of, not like sharing of information so much as like echoing of thoughts and ideas and experiences that kind of bounce and reverberate between us. I don't know, it's an interesting thought, right? And again, if in one of these possible worlds, existing, is that where authors come up with their ideas, right? Is that where the Chronicles of Narnia ultimately came into C.S. Lewis's mind? That there's some bleed over from another reality where those events are actually happening. I mean, again, if you pause it for the moment, that they do in fact exist in a multiple, at a multi-dimensional, infinitely, expanding universe where these things do exist, and you have an author in our reality writing down history from an alternate existence. What other explanation would there be for these creative thoughts coming into their minds, right? That the battles and struggles of people in the first age of Middle Earth against the Dark Lord Melkor, who's the kind of proto-Satan in the Silmarillion that came before Sauron in the Lord of the Rings, right? And the elves, fighting this, eternal battle against the Dark Lord Melkor, and all the things that those characters suffer and experience in very, heroic and dramatic stories. Again, if there's infinite number of possible realities, and those things actually happen to those beings, and then Tolkien, in a completely disconnected, or almost completely disconnected, different reality, is putting pen to paper and transcribing the events that happen to these beings. I don't know, it's an interesting idea, right? And you think about the phenomena of, agency, free will, choice, in the context of a multiverse like that. If all possible actions and outcomes exist infinitely beyond us, what does that mean for choices that we make? Those of you who are old enough to have played with an analog radio, this is kind of what it makes me think of, right? When you just spun that tuning wheel through, a variety of radio stations, and all of that information is just floating out there on the airwaves, and generally not accessible to us except when you would tune the radio to that particular frequency, right? And what if that's really what choice or free will is, right? Not so much a conscious and deliberate act per se, but more us attuning our being to a particular frequency and aligning ourselves to that reality, and that reality manifesting around us. And that there's other iterations of ourselves, or people somewhat resembling us, who made different decisions and exist in a different state. And it's just, I don't know. It's all metaphysics, right? It's unknowable. It's just kind of thought-provoking, fascinating to think about. And if that's the case, right? If all possible worlds, do exist, and we're sort of, navigating through maybe different realities depending on our actions, right? How we attune ourselves to our existence. It makes you wonder, what we are actually capable of, again, within the constraints of how the laws of physics and such work in our universe, but what our potential actually is if we really kind of embrace the thought that we can navigate ourselves into a preferred form of existence, if that makes sense. That we that version of ourselves that we wish to be is out there, and something we can manifest if we just align ourselves to it. That's not a hugely deep or profound thing to say. It's just another way of saying be who you want to be, make the choices you want to make. But I don't know, it somehow different to me to say that that person that I want to be is actually already out there in the ether, right? And I just have to align myself to that, right? I know I've talked before again about the Stoics and the meditation of the sage, right? And pondering, the ideal version of ourselves and what small steps we can make each day to more and more become that person. I don't know. Interesting stuff. What do you guys think of all that? I know it wandered a little bit, but multiverse. Do you think it's out there? What do you think metaphysics in general? Is it just wasted time to think about stuff like that? I don't know. I don't have a whole lot better to do in the car. Could listen to the radio. I don't know. Uplifting and inspiring as always. It's been fun. See you on the next one.